Sarah Beyer again, part of the New York Passive House Board and part of the planning committee for this event. It is my delight to introduce Chris Magwood, who was planning to be here in person, but his flight was canceled. So we're very glad that he's here to join virtually. He's obsessed with helping to reverse climate change by making carbon storing buildings that are also healthy, beautiful, efficient, and inspiring. In 2022, he joined RMI's Embodied Carbon Initiative within their carbon-free buildings team. He's the author of many books on carbon and construction, including his latest with Bruce King called Build Beyond Zero, which has an extremely hopeful and actionable message that inspired us to invite him to speak with us today. We hope you are invigorated by the creative possibilities of this rapidly developing way of envisioning building materials. Significant reductions in embodied carbon are possible today on every business as usual project, about 30% or so, as demonstrated by a recent RMI report and many other reports. But what Chris is talking about today is how architecture can not only do a little less harm, but how we can actually be a solution to the crisis. Please keep in mind again to hold your questions till the Q&A panel at the end of the symposium, and thank you, Chris.
All right, I hope that that I'm visible and my slides are visible, and my sincere regrets at not being there today. I was at the airport in Toronto bright and early this morning. Unfortunately, so was an awful lot of fog, and they decided to cancel all the flights until such time as it made it impossible for me to get there. So I'm glad that I'm still able to speak with everybody here, and really pleased to be following the two previous presenters, both of whom I have admired from afar for a long time, and I think whose messages will dovetail into what I'm about to talk about very well. So very glad to be here. I snapped this little picture as I left the airport this morning, but that's why I'm not here. That's what Toronto looked like this morning. So here I am. And I'm going to go through some of these slides a little bit quickly because I think probably most people in the room understand this. And I think the Passive House Institute has definitely been at the forefront of sort of bringing this to our attention, not only as a problem, but really a solution to that buildings are a huge part of the climate crisis. The amount of emissions that happen from operating buildings is big. And like Dr. Feist said, the way that we count that, it can be done differently, but when you think about the energy burned in buildings, the energy burned to power buildings from a distance, it does get up into sort of estimates from 20 to 40% of all global emissions come from the operating of buildings, and so clearly this is a place where we've needed to intervene. But in having our eye on that ball, and as important as it is, we've sort of not paid really much attention to the emissions that arise from making the buildings in the first place, and largely from making the materials that go into the buildings. So we've kept a really great focus on operational emissions, and until quite recently, almost no focus on these so-called embodied emissions, or the emissions that arise from making materials and then putting those materials together into buildings. So for a long time, I think that the material related emissions were sort of ignored, because when you looked at the scale of emissions associated with buildings back when buildings were a whole lot less efficient, and you chose any kind of reasonable time window. So here I'm giving a sort of 30-year snapshot. A code compliant building of even a decade ago, by 30 years out, the operating emissions would be significantly higher than the emissions that are associated with making the materials up front. So, that yellow stripe being the kind of emissions associated with materials, and that rising blue arrow being annual emissions kind of adding up year after year. And you don't have to go very far out into the future before those operating emissions were big, and so that's where the attention got placed. However, as we get closer to being able to make zero operating carbon buildings, whether that's on the new construction side or by retrofitting our buildings, both by making the buildings themselves more energy efficient, and also starting to switch to renewables, which have much less emission associated with them in the production of that energy. We can really see a pretty viable pathway to very close to zero carbon emission buildings on the operating side. Lots of projects kind of demonstrating the potential for that today, but we can sort of see in the way codes are moving, in the way voluntary measures like Passive House are moving, that there is a pathway to getting that little blue line down to pretty close to zero. But if we do that and we don't address the embodied carbon emissions from all those materials, we're only addressing a portion of the problem. And really, when we kind of take a snapshot of those same graphs in the short window of time that we have to start really turning the corner on our climate emissions, we can see that whether we're talking an older, less efficient building, or a brand new zero carbon building, or anything in between, that however we're addressing the energy efficiency side, the materials portion is going to represent a huge amount of the emissions that we need to address in the next decade, or even in the next couple of decades. And so this is not at all to say we start ignoring the operating emissions. We absolutely have to keep driving those down, and we absolutely have to get those to zero. But in terms of the emissions that are going to be the bulk of what affects the climate over at least the next decade, if not two, we really have to start thinking about the materials and the emissions associated with them. It becomes sort of the catchphrase in the building world. Everybody's got a zero goal of some kind, but getting to zero just means that we're doing less harm, and we absolutely need to be doing less harm than we have been doing historically. But really, what we want to do is get to a point where our buildings are potentially responsible for starting to heal the climate by taking a whole lot of that CO2 that's in the atmosphere that needs to come out, and using our buildings basically as repositories for a lot of that carbon. So the way that we start to examine, how this works and what materials are responsible for what level of emissions is typically through environmental product declarations, which are an ISO standardized way of reporting on the life cycle impacts of particular material or product. People call them a nutrition label for building materials, and instead of things like calories and fat, we're talking about things like global warming potential and some of the other impacts like acidification and eutrophication and ozone depletion. Those are all things that are considered in an EPD. For when we're thinking about buildings and climate, we're thinking about the global warming potential. So that's a number in carbon dioxide equivalent that's attached to a certain amount of building material from a certain manufacturer, undertaking a certain process to make that material. And so there are EPDs for all kinds of individual products and materials. And if you want to understand the carbon footprint of a whole building, you're essentially, adding up the value from all the EPDs times the amount of the material you're using in that building, gives you an amount of kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, often per meter squared of the building area. And that sort of looking at it that way allows building owners and designers and everybody involved to start to say, well, let's if this is what our building is responsible for emitting today, let's look at how we start to reduce that and hopefully do so in line with sort of real science-based climate targets that will hopefully keep us under 1.5 C. And the strategies that it takes to reduce the overall carbon footprint of a building on its material side are pretty straightforward. There's really just two. One is you lower the impacts from materials that have high emissions, and those are some of our most widely used building materials like concrete, steel, aluminum, glass, and plastic. All of those, for a variety of different reasons, tend to have really high levels of emissions associated with them. And we're not going to do without those materials anytime soon, but there are some great things happening in the manufacture of all of those materials that allow us to at least start choosing versions of them that have less impact. And then if we take that and marry it with the increased use of materials that have, I guess, sometimes it's called negative emissions, but basically that store carbon that has come out of the atmosphere in the material, the more of those we can put into buildings, we can start to offset the materials that still have emissions. And if we can get that balance, weighted heavily enough in favor of the carbon storing materials, we can actually start to make net zero emission buildings from the material side and not just the operating side. So we can put carbon into buildings basically in two ways. We can use biomass-based materials, so things that have drawn carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and we're kind of taking the carbon that they've taken out of the atmosphere and bundling it up and putting it away in a building so that it doesn't return to the atmosphere. And then there's actually carbonized materials where we're either using processes of biomineralization, so using biological processes that draw carbon out of the atmosphere but turn it into mineral form, or the use of waste CO2, whether that's direct air capture of carbon or capture of carbon out of the stacks of power plants or other high emitters, sort of pulling the CO2 from there and recarbonizing it into a material that can go into a building. So really just two pathways, but the kinds of materials and the way that we use them in buildings would be quite different between those two paths. So I'll just kind of take you down both of those paths fairly quickly. So bio-based architecture is materials that use photosynthesis, and most dry plant matter, especially of the type that we would end up putting in buildings, carbon that came out of the atmosphere is anywhere from sort of 35 to 55% of the dry weight of any plant matter, whether that be a stalk of hemp or a 2x4 or a stick of bamboo or the stalk of a straw or rice plant. About roughly half of the weight of all of those dry materials is carbon. So that all came out of the atmosphere, and if we can put it in a building and prevent it from going back to the atmosphere, we've sort of made an impact in the overall climate balance. So the carbon cycle, essentially what we're doing is interrupting the carbon cycle. We currently intentionally grow all kinds of plant materials and use parts of them, but the parts that we don't use, or the materials that we make out of them and use only briefly, they are returned back to the atmosphere fairly quickly. An awful lot of ag residues still get burned off in the field. We incinerate a lot of things like paper waste, like clothing waste, or we put them in landfills where they break down into methane. But essentially, there's this carbon loop. The carbon's coming out of the atmosphere, but it's going back to the atmosphere relatively quickly. And building with biomass is an attempt to interrupt that cycle. So you still have the drawdown part, but instead of letting it go right back to the atmosphere, you can keep it out. And buildings are a great place to keep it out because they tend to be quite long-lived. We often think of, or life cycle assessment thinks of buildings as having a 60-year lifespan, but we can really think of buildings as having much longer lifespans than that too. And so this gives us a place to remove a lot of CO2 from the atmosphere and keep it out of the atmosphere. And we can talk about what might happen to it later when it's no longer in the building. But if it can really help us address the climate crisis over the next century, then that's a really great strategy for us to be engaged in. And there are lots of ways to think about how biomass, storing biomass works on behalf of the climate. Ton-year accounting is one way to look at it, where you look at the sort of residence of CO2 in the atmosphere and the amount of warming that it drives while it's in the atmosphere, and then look at what an amount of carbon stored over a certain period of time. And basically when the areas in the emissions side, the yellow side of this graph, and the storage side, the blue side, when the areas are equal, then the stored biomass has done the job of offsetting that amount of emission. So in this case, you're seeing a pulse of 1 ton of CO2 at year 0, and also temporary storage of a ton. And so if you can store that ton of CO2, say in a building for about 46 years, it will have done the same as offsetting that ton of emissions. So a way to sort of figure out how long we need to keep carbon in the building to have a meaningful impact. And obviously, if you can store that carbon for longer than 46 years, it actually has the impact of offsetting more emissions than the ton that it was doing at 46 years. Love to get into that more with folks. It's a sort of big concept in a short amount of time, but one of the first questions that always comes up when I talk about carbon storage in buildings, it's like, yeah, but at the end of its lifespan, it all comes back, and doesn't that defeat the whole purpose? And the idea of looking at it through the lens of climate science is to say, well, no, actually, there's a length of time that if we can keep it out, it's doing really important work over that time. And if it comes out, and I think we're clever enough to figure out how to not just let all that carbon go back to the atmosphere at the end of the building's life, but even if it does, over which is the length of time that we have to deal with the climate crisis, it's playing a really important role. So there are 5 basic categories of biomass building materials, and I think right now there aren't any real standards for how we measure the value of carbon stored from all 5 of these streams. But I think as this gets explored more fully, we'll find out that there are very different ways that we might want to look at each of these, because some involve a lot of land use change, some involve no land use change, and the emissions that are kind of associated with all of that. But again, a topic for a longer conversation than this one. But as Dr. Feist pointed out, timber, the way that in its most simple form, timber gets valued as carbon storage, I think is not accurate. I don't think for timber we can just say, well, there's X weight in carbon atoms in this 2x4 or in this slab of mass timber in this building, and say that we've meaningfully stored that much carbon, because forests are complicated ecosystems, and the way we use trees is kind of complicated to figure out. But right off the bat, when we cut down a tree to turn it into a wood product, we are typically cutting it down long before its lifespan as a carbon sink is over. So we're essentially ending its ability to continue to store carbon when we cut it down. And then we're typically using less than half of the actual mass of a tree when we take it down, ends up as a building material that's going to last a while. The other half of the tree is sawdust, it's bark, it's shavings, it's stuff that ends up, it's slash on the forest floor. This is stuff that ends up going back to the atmosphere quite quickly after we cut down the tree. And so, even very simple math of, if we cut down a tree, it's got 10 tons of carbon, we only put 5 in the building and we sent 5 back to the atmosphere, we haven't really, helped the climate at all. We've simply, balanced an equation there where we haven't maybe made it worse. But if we think about the root mass of that tree, which doesn't get counted in most of those calculations, and it's usually around 20% of the biomass, and it's going to return to the atmosphere. And if we started measuring the carbon that comes out of the soils as we disturb those forests, we would end up needing to really understand that ecosystem a lot more before we want to attribute meaningful carbon storage to virgin timber products. But there are things, especially agricultural residues, where we have vast stocks of them being produced already today. And I was really glad to hear the first presenter talk about land use change and degradation of soils, because again, we could have a long discussion about current farming practices and where these ag residues are coming from. But that conversation aside, right now, even just in terms of cereal grains, we grow billions of tons of cereal grains around the world every year. We eat the little seed head off the top, and the stalk that grows underneath that seed head is considered waste. In most countries, it's still burned off. And if it's not burned off, it's usually just rotted off on the field. And so, with 2.2 billion tons a year of global grain straw production, every single year, the growth of the grain that all our farmers grow draws down the emissions from the country of India. So that material removes the volume of emissions that India, which is the 3rd biggest emitter on the planet, puts into the atmosphere. And we collect it all, and then we let it go back to the atmosphere. So, if we could take half even of that annual grain straw harvest, we would be, and putting it into somewhere durable like a building, we'd be achieving a 2 billion ton drawdown annually from stuff that we're already growing. We're already using that land, we're already making those inputs, we're already running that machinery, and we're just not capturing the carbon that's being stored there. We also have a range of purpose-grown crops that for either a long time in the case of cork and bamboo, or more recently in terms of hemp and seaweed. We're actually planting these materials. They have very short growth cycles. Most of them, cork bark is an interesting one because the trees get very old. We harvest the bark from the trees, but we don't kill the trees when we do that. So, that's a different type of product than when we cut down trees for timber. But anyway, there's a whole category here of purpose-grown crops where the climate math is a little bit different, because all the inputs required to grow these materials need to be counted as sort of emissions against the storage. And every crop has its own particular needs and ways of being used, and different impacts in terms of land use change. But I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Waste stream fibers are an incredible opportunity. Dr. Feist mentioned a couple of these, but the cellulose, I think, is one of the unsung heroes of the sort of carbon storage movement right now, which is just made from waste newsprint and cardboard. But building materials are being made out of used drinking boxes, used textiles, urban biomass, like all of these fibers that are already being sort of grown, harvested, processed, and then thrown out. And instead, we could stop that carbon from going back to the atmosphere and again put it into buildings. And then the last category I find incredibly excited, which is lab-grown materials. So this is now stepping completely outside the paradigm of go out into nature and go get a bunch of stuff and bring it to a factory and turn it into building materials. Here we're using biological processes in a factory to grow all kinds of materials. And mycelium-based materials have been the most promising so far, including Occamworks, who's making some really interesting structural materials with mycelium. Magwood, that's making floor tiles and wall tiles, and Biome that's making some cladding and wall divider products. This field really excites me because it really does change the paradigm of how we think about materials and what we do with materials, and the potential for carbon storage here is really vast. The biomineralized materials are not as widely available yet, but this area is super exciting because, as many of you will know, concrete is one of our biggest emitting materials, well, the biggest emitting material in the construction realm. And so ways to try to replace either all the ingredients of concrete or certain parts of concrete with different types of mineralized CO2 is really important. So Blue Planet is making carbonated aggregate from waste stream CO2 from smokestack emissions. Phytostone is using biochar to make ceiling and wall panels. And we're going to hear from somebody from Prometheus, I believe. I've been working some on carbon storing material reports and stuff with Will Schubar from Prometheus, and I'm really excited about what they're doing with algae grown aggregate. Biomass is now to market with their tiles and bricks that are like a microbe grown version of concrete. So not a huge amount. I think Prometheus is the only one there that you can buy in some quantity today, but a huge amount of potential to again sort of reimagine where the carbon comes from and where it goes to in our buildings when we think about the mineralized materials. And then another sort of category of materials that aren't biogenic quite and aren't carbon storing quite, they're earth-based materials, and they're kind of extremely low carbon emitting materials because in most cases, the earth that is being used here needs very little in terms of modification to make it into durable building products like earthen floor slabs, exterior wall cladding panels like in the bottom left, cast in place rammed earth or rammed earth concrete masonry units. So these materials kind of occupy an interesting place where you can sort of pull concrete and cement materials with earthen materials, and they're not storing carbon, but the amount of emissions has been reduced dramatically. So also a sort of a whole realm of materials there to explore as you're looking at how do you get to a net zero carbon on your materials. And I think, what really excites me is that there's so much going on in this field right now in terms of new products being developed, new processes being developed, new things coming out all the time. I'm living and breathing these materials, and I feel like every time I turn around, there's something new that I haven't seen. And so, right now, what we really have is not a technological problem. We just have a scaling problem. All of these things are things that are kind of ready to be scaled up, and they're kind of seeking the funding and the support and all the stuff that it takes to go from these really great kind of prototype ideas to things that can be purchased and applied to buildings all over the world. And I'll just give you quickly now a sense of, this is not kind of pie in the sky dreaming in terms of new construction. There are some extremely large buildings in Europe doing the thing that Dr. Feist, specifically was talking about, which is, being incredibly energy efficient. So having really a lot of insulation, great air tightness, and all of the things that it takes to drive the operational emissions down, but doing so with carbon storing materials. So this is a large school in France that was built with prefabricated straw bale wall panels. You can see them being built in the factory on the top right there and kind of assembled on site on the bottom right. This is a large shopping mall in the UK, and similarly made from panels, but this time of hempcrete or hemp lime as opposed to straw. But again, both these buildings sort of taking a timber frame and marrying it with a really great carbon storing insulation material turned into a panel that makes it sort of fast and easy to apply. And I think this is really the direction that things can go if we want to be tackling both the operational and the material emissions and getting them down to zero. A smaller version of a building like this. This was one that I was involved in building at Trent University in 2020. So this is net zero certified from its operational emissions. It produces all the energy that it uses on the PV panels on the roof, but we also came very close to being net zero emissions on the material side. You can see here in the pink, we had a base case, the way the university was going to build this building before we got involved and tried to help them source some different materials. So it was going to have 211 tons of emissions associated with its materials, and we got that down to 25 tons. So an 88% reduction without raising the cost of the building and with actually raising the performance of the building from what it was going to be. And so, I think that's, in this case, a building that I was involved with and could actually sort of measure and verify that we were on this path. And I think, hopefully we'll start seeing more and more people doing that too. We've, now are measuring the operational impact of buildings, but I think we really need to start measuring and then reducing the materials side as well. And because this is a symposium on retrofits, I thought this would be an interesting project to show. This was in the Netherlands, the De Roomley Sports Hall. It's a large building, 28,000 square feet. When they decided to retrofit it to improve its energy performance, they decided to try to use carbon storage techniques in order to do that. And so they made these prefabricated wall panels. You can see some of the sample panels on the top left. It's basically a chopped straw insulation that's blown into those wood frame boxes with a fire retardant wood fiberboard insulation on the exterior, and then wrapped with an air tightness and weatherproofing membrane, and then a charred wood siding over top of that. And so a great example of a larger building being retrofit to try to achieve zero emissions, but doing so with materials that are also pushing in the zero emissions direction. And I'm going to wind up. I'm going to show you a study that some of my colleagues at RMI are working on. So RMI has a program called Realize that's helping do retrofits on existing buildings. And we looked at the embodied carbon, the material related carbon emissions from different materials that you might use to insulate an existing building. So what you can see here is that if we're trying to insulate, make a panel or an on-site construction that would add R30 to the exterior of a large multifamily building, you can achieve that R30 and have a whole range of different impacts in terms of material emissions. Everything from having almost 30 kilograms of emissions per square foot of wall that you're covering when you're using things like XPS foam boards as that insulation. And then you can see, the numbers go down to the point where you're getting pretty close to zero, and then, dipping below zero for some materials if enough portions of that wall panel are made with carbon storing materials. So the reason that that's important is when you go ahead and choose materials to do those retrofits, if you're choosing the worst possible materials in terms of their emissions, so this is from a real case study that a building that RMI was involved in retrofitting, they did the retrofit and halved the energy emissions from the building. So that building on the top right used to emit 105 metric tons of emissions per year. They got it down to 53 by doing this retrofit. But if they did that with this XPS foam method, you would lose 6.5 years of those energy savings on the operation side to just doing the retrofit in the first place. If you used a slightly better array of materials, in this case, a mineral wool type panel, you could take that down to 1.5 years. But if you did the carbon storage option, you're realizing those savings right from day one. And I think, as we look at really needing to get our emissions down in the next 10 years, if we're losing, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those years of savings from the work we're doing on a building to reduce its operating emissions, then we're really not helping until after it's getting too late to help. So I think it's really important, as we necessarily focus on reducing emissions from existing buildings, that we attempt to do so in a way that that affects the climate the least, or hopefully actually improves the climate from the materials point of view. And I think I'm going to skip those 2 slides just to let you know that was talking about interiors, where there's also a huge potential for being able to store carbon in materials that we put inside buildings, but we can save that for later. And I'm just going to wrap up with a note for the book that Bruce and I wrote this year. And if you want to explore any of these ideas in more detail, that's a great way to do so. And I hope I whipped through that in enough time. I really, thanks to the organizers, I really appreciate the opportunity to come and present, and to, if not be in the room with you, at least share some ideas with you, and hopefully be able to participate in some of the Q&A session a bit later on today too. So thank you.